You wake up in a cramped wooden house. Your neighbor's coughing turns into screaming by nightfall, then silence. The streets are filled with carts not of goods but bodies. There's no cure, no escape, and every choice could kill you. Would you pray, flee, or bleed yourself in desperation? The Black Death wasn't just a disease. It was a test of luck, belief, and brutal survival. So, if you lived in 1348, would you have made it out alive? In October 1347, a fleet of 12 Genoese ships slipped into the port of Messina on the northeastern coast of Sicily. The crew on board was barely alive. Some were dead before the mooring lines hit the docks. Others stumbled onto land, black, boils swelling in their armpits and groins, vomiting blood, delirious with fever. The townspeople watched in horror. Within days, the disease spread like fire through dry grass. At first, the locals had no name for it. They spoke of a curse, divine punishment, or a poisoned wind. But the symptoms were unmistakable, painful. Swelling spuboes, followed by high fever, vomiting, and often death within 3 to 5 days. The mortality rate was staggering. Entire households vanished in a week. Priests refused last rites. Physicians fled. And yet, no one knew where it had come from or how to stop it. The disease would later be identified as the bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas that infested black rats. These rats had traveled aboard merchant ships, thriving in the holds, unnoticed until it was too late. The plague likely originated in the arid plains of Central Asia and traveled westward through trade routes, reaching the Black Sea ports by 1346. There, Mongol armies besieging the Genoese trading post of Kaffa reportedly catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. A chilling case of early biological warfare. Fleeing merchants carried the disease across the sea to Constantinople. Then to Sicily, from Messina, the plague moved with terrifying speed. Within weeks, it reached mainland Italy first, Genoa, then Pisa and Venice. By the spring of 1348, it was in France and Spain. London would be struck by the end of that year. The Mediterranean trading network, once a source of wealth and connection, now served as a highway for death. Europe had no immunity. No one under the age of 70 had seen anything like it. The last comparable outbreak had struck during the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. Medical understanding had hardly advanced since then. Galenic theory, rooted in the balance of humors, dominated. Contagion was barely understood. Isolation measures were haphazard. Entire cities, Florence, Avignon, Paris, were overwhelmed. Within weeks of first contact, contemporary chroniclers were stunned. The Florentine writer Matteo Villani wrote that those who fell sick, male or female, lingered only 3 days, and died without any fever or other accessory. In Marseille, over half the population perished in a few months. In some towns, bodies piled up in the streets. Burial pits were dug by the hundreds. The Pope at Avignon consecrated the Rhône river so corpses could be dumped directly into the water. The arrival of the plague was not just a health crisis. It was a collapse of normal life. Commerce halted. Courts stopped functioning. Agriculture withered as fields went unplowed. And as the disease spread, so did fear, suspicion, and rumor, setting the stage for social unrest that would follow. By the time Europe understood the scale of what was happening, it was already too late. The death toll would rise to tens of millions, and the old world would not survive unchanged. In 1348, as death swept through cities and villages, most people had no idea what was killing them. There were no microscopes, No concept of bacteria, no germ theory. Instead, medical explanations drew from ancient beliefs passed down from Greek and Roman texts, especially the works of Galen and Hippocrates. These frameworks shaped everything the medieval world understood about illness. According to human theory, the human body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health came from their balance. Illness meant something had become excessive or deficient. The plague, then, wasn't seen as a contagious disease but a consequence of internal imbalance triggered by external forces: bad air, alignment of the planets, or divine punishment. One dominant theory blamed miasma, poisonous air. The air was thought to be corrupted by decaying matter, eclipses, or conjunctions of the planets. In March 1345, a widely circulated astrological report claimed that a rare alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had corrupted the atmosphere and caused the outbreak. Physicians advised people to avoid night air, carry fragrant herbs, and burn incense to protect themselves. In cities like Florence and Paris, perfumed gloves, dried flowers, and pomanders became common tools of self-defense. Religious interpretations were equally widespread. Many believed the plague was a punishment for sin. Public processions formed. Whipping rituals spread across Europe as bands of flagellants traveled from town to town, beating themselves in penance, hoping to appease divine wrath. The Church itself offered prayers and masses, but struggled to explain why even the most devout were dying in such numbers. The role of physicians was limited. Those trained in university medicine relied on complex astrological charts and urine analysis. They prescribed diets, bloodletting, and purgatives to rebalance the body. Plague-specific treatments ranged from the absurd to the dangerous. Patients were bled with knives or leeches. Swellings were lanced and packed with dried toads or poultices made of onions, butter, or even human waste. None of it worked. In some cases, the cure accelerated death. Boiling water and vinegar were used to clean wounds, often worsening infections. One widely shared recipe called for crushed emeralds mixed with wine. Only the wealthiest could afford it. It was useless. The image of the plague doctor with the beaked mask emerged later in the 17th century, but some precursors existed in the 14th century. Their function was often bureaucratic more than medical, counting the dead, certifying deaths, and attempting basic quarantine. Cities like Venice began implementing forced isolation, what would become the first official quarantines by the late 1340s, but even then, understanding of disease transmission was crude. With no understanding of fleas or rodents, few suspected the true vector. Rats thrived in Europe's towns. Fleas jumped from host to host. People believed the air, or God, or the stars were responsible. And in their confusion, they turned to the only tools they had: ritual, superstition, and medicine that hadn't changed in over 1,000 years. As bodies piled higher, even the most learned realized their methods were failing. But without a new framework to replace them, they could only keep doing what they had always done, hoping something might work before it reached their own door in 14th century Europe. The poor made up the overwhelming majority of the population. Whether in the countryside or within the growing cities, daily life for them was harsh long before the plague arrived. Most peasants lived in single-room wooden homes with thatched roofs, packed with family members, animals, and insects. There was no running water, no sanitation, and no separation between living quarters and waste. Floors were often dirt. Beds, if they existed, were straw piles. In urban slums, it was worse: overcrowded tenements stacked against each other, alleys barely wide enough to walk through, and chamber pots emptied straight onto the street. Cleanliness was rare. Soap was expensive, and bathing was uncommon. Fleas and lice were constant companions. Open sewers flowed through towns, mixing human waste with animal carcasses and rotting food. Rats thrived in these conditions, especially the black rattratus. Rattus, a key carrier of the fleas that transmitted the bubonic plague. When the disease struck, it spread fastest and killed most brutally in these environments. The poor had no means to escape. Unlike the wealthy, they couldn't flee to rural estates or isolate in private villas. They stayed where they lived, packed into cities like Florence, Avignon, and London, where infection jumped quickly from one house to the next. There was no help coming. Physicians rarely treated the poor. Medical knowledge, limited as it was, belonged to the literate and privileged. The poor turned instead to local healers, midwives, or religious figures, none of whom had any effective remedies. They tried burning herbs, hanging charms, fasting, or joining prayer gatherings. Nothing slowed the death toll. In towns like Montpellier, Paris, and York, entire working-class districts were emptied within weeks. Laborers, servants, bakers, and artisans collapsed in their homes or on the streets. Children died without last rites. Mothers buried their own without ceremony. The dead went uncollected for days. In some cities, carts rolled through neighborhoods, calling for bodies. When those carts stopped coming, mass graves were dug by those still able to lift a shovel. The social order began to fracture. Landlords died or fled. Food prices soared. Local markets collapsed. Fields went untilled. Bread disappeared from stalls. The poor, already near starvation, now faced famine on top of plague. In places like Siena, chroniclers noted that people died by the hundreds both day and night. And when the local government failed, bodies were dragged to ditches and buried by the few left standing. Some tried to find answers in faith. Chapels and cathedrals filled with desperate prayers. But priests too were dying. Monks and nuns, often among the first to serve the sick, suffered some of the highest death rates. In some parishes, entire clergy populations were wiped out. The poor, losing both their families and their spiritual leaders, were left in silence. There was no consistent record-keeping for the lower classes, no names, no tombstones. Most of their stories vanished with them, but tax rolls and manorial accounts show the aftermath. In some English villages, up to 70% of the peasant population disappeared. In urban centers, mortality reached levels so high that some districts were never fully repopulated. Labor shortages would eventually shift power dynamics in their favor, but for those living through 1348, there was no future to imagine. Just the stench, the silence, and the knowledge that death had reached even the lowest, filthiest corner of Europe, and it was not leaving any time soon. In 1348, as the plague advanced across Europe, the wealthy did what they had always done. In times of danger, they withdrew. Nobles, landowners, and successful merchants packed up their families, servants, and possessions and fled the cities. Villas in the hills, rural monasteries, and fortified country estates became sanctuaries. The logic was simple. Distance meant safety. If the disease was in the streets of Florence, then the countryside might offer escape. Giovanni Boccaccio captured this impulse firsthand. In the introduction to the Decameron, he described 10 Florentines, young, wealthy and educated, who retreated to a secluded villa just outside the city to wait out the epidemic. The fictional frame was grounded in reality. Boccaccio had witnessed the plague devastate Florence. His account reflected what many of his class were actually doing. But escape didn't guarantee survival. Wealth bought distance, not immunity. Some rural estates were spared. Others became death traps when the disease arrived later through traveling servants, contaminated goods, or passing travelers. In 1349, English landowner Henry of Grosmont, Duke of Lancaster, retreated with his household to a manor in Leicestershire. Within weeks, members of his staff fell ill. The countryside was no longer untouched. Nonetheless, statistics suggest that the wealthy did have better odds. They had the means to isolate, access to private physicians, and cleaner, more spacious living conditions. They could afford imported food and clean water. They had time and space to avoid contact with strangers. In Venice, the ruling patrician class implemented some of the earliest quarantine protocols, keeping themselves separated from incoming ships and external commerce. It helped. The Venetian government would go on to establish the first formal quarantine station in the island of Lazaretto Vecchio in 1423. But even among elites, fear overran logic. Some locked themselves away completely, refusing to touch silver coins or accept visitors. Others sought safety through extreme measures. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI, surrounded by corpses, sat between two constantly burning fires based on the miasma theory to purify the air. He survived, while much of the papal court did not. Socially, the plague exposed the limits of privilege. Those who fled often returned to cities in chaos. Property had changed hands. Servants had died. Fields had gone untended. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Yet, in the aftermath, the elite were often best positioned to recover. They bought up cheap land, married into newly wealthy families, and expanded their influence. Survivors among the merchant class in cities like Florence, Bruges, and Lubeck emerged more powerful than before. For many, the illusion of escape had worked temporarily, but wealth couldn't buy certainty. No villa was far enough. No gate was tall enough. The plague moved without logic or mercy. It touched kings and cardinals just as it did beggars. Yet for those with gold and land, there were options. And in a century ruled by proximity and contagion, even a false sense of control was better than none at all. By 1348, death had become unrelenting. In towns and cities across Europe, churches overflowed, not with worshippers, but with the dead. The bells that once marked holy days now tolled constantly for mass burials. For the faithful, the plague was more than disease. It was judgment. The Church, central to medieval life, responded with prayer, fasting, and public rituals. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI ordered that masses be said daily for the dead. In England, King Edward III ordered processions in hopes of divine mercy. In many cities, clergy led barefoot marches through the streets, carrying relics, chanting hymns, begging God to lift the curse. But these rituals brought crowds, and crowds brought infection. Inadvertently, the Church's most visible responses helped the plague spread. The explanation offered by many clergy was clear. This was punishment for sin. Corruption, vanity, heresy, and pride had provoked divine wrath. People believed it. Fear turned into self-blame. Families confessed sins publicly. Processions grew more extreme. And into this atmosphere of fear stepped the flagellants. The flagellant movement had existed before the plague, but during the Black Death, it surged across Europe. Bands of men, sometimes hundreds at a time, marched from town to town, shirtless, chanting and whipping themselves until blood streamed down their backs. They believed that by reenacting Christ's suffering, they could atone for the sins of mankind and end the plague. The movement spread quickly, especially in the German-speaking regions, northern France, and the Low Countries. While the Church initially tolerated them, their rise soon became a threat to ecclesiastical authority. Flagellant groups often condemned priests and bishops, claiming the Church had become too corrupt to act as God's instrument. Some refused papal authority outright. In October 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull condemning the flagellants and ordering their suppression. Many were dispersed or arrested. Religious fervor also fueled violence. In dozens of towns across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, Jews were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague. These were not isolated rumors, they sparked massacres. In Strasbourg, on February 14, 1349, over 2,000 Jews were burned alive. In Mainz, Cologne, and Erfurt, entire communities were wiped out. Many of these attacks were incited by preachers or tolerated by local officials. The plague provided justification for long-simmering anti-Semitism. In some cases, city leaders expelled Jews not only out of fear but to seize their property and cancel debts. Even within the Church, confidence wavered. Thousands of priests and monks died tending to the sick. Entire monasteries vanished. In England alone, the death toll among clergy reached nearly half in some dioceses. The loss hollowed the institution. New priests, hastily ordained, often lacked training. Public trust faltered. Still, faith remained the lens through which most people made sense of the catastrophe. For some, the plague was a sign of the approaching apocalypse. For others, it was a reason to repent. And for many, it was simply a tester crucible through which belief and fear burned side by side, leaving behind a church that would never fully recover its old authority. As the death toll rose, reason gave way to fear, and fear demanded someone to blame. With no cure, no clear explanation, and no end in sight, the people of 14th century Europe turned against their neighbors. In the grip of mass panic, minorities became scapegoats. Chief among them were the Jews. Accusations began circulating in 1348 in towns across Switzerland, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Rumors spread that Jewish communities had poisoned wells to cause the plague. There was no evidence, but the climate was ripe for suspicion. Jews lived in separate quarters, followed distinct religious customs, and were often exempt from the Christian sacramental system. Their very difference, long tolerated, occasionally resented, now marked them as targets. The first major violence erupted in Toulon, France, where dozens of Jews were massacred in April 1348. From there, the hysteria spread. In Basel, a mob led by local officials rounded up the Jewish population, sealed them in a wooden house on an island in the Rhine, and set it ablaze. Over 600 were killed. The city council then banned Jews from returning for 200 years. In Strasbourg, the massacre came despite the city not yet experiencing plague deaths. On February 14, 1349, Valentine's Day, over 2,000 Jews were herded into a cemetery and burned alive. Their property was seized. Debts owed to them were cancelled. The local bishop and some city councillors opposed the violence, but they were overruled by guild leaders and panicked citizens. Even where leaders attempted protection, mobs acted. In Mainz and Cologne, Jewish quarters were stormed. Entire communities were annihilated. Thousands died across the Rhineland. Some fled eastward into Poland and Lithuania, where rulers like Casimir III offered temporary refuge. The role of the Church was mixed. Pope Clement VI issued 2 bulls condemning the violence, stating that Jews were dying of the plague like everyone else, and that the accusations were baseless. But his orders were often ignored. Local authorities, sometimes motivated by religious zeal, sometimes by greed, allowed or even led the attacks. The pogroms were not just acts of violence, they were systematic. Jewish homes were burned, synagogues destroyed, Torah scrolls desecrated. Centuries of cultural life in cities like Erfurt, Speyer, and Worms were erased in a matter of weeks. The Black Death killed millions, but it also exposed something deeper. When society collapsed, fear was weaponized. Neighbors turned into enemies. Survival wasn't just about disease, was about whether the crowd decided you were safe or guilty. Imagine standing in the center of Florence in the spring of 1348. You hear the bells, not for weddings or mass, but for funerals. The streets are quieter than usual. Doors are shut. Smoke rises, not just from chimneys, but from burning clothes, furniture, anything touched by the sick. You don't know it yet, but the decisions you make in the next few days might determine whether you live or die. If you were poor, your options would already be limited. Your home is cramped. The alleyways around you are filled with waste and rats. You can't afford to leave. And even if you could, where would you go? Most roads are watched. Some cities are turning refugees away at the gate. In England, entire villages sealed themselves off. In Milan, officials went further, bricking infected families inside their homes. Milan suffered lower death rates than many cities, but the price was brutal. If you were wealthy, you might flee early. That was the path taken by nobles in Tuscany and by the characters in Boccaccio's Decameron. Retreat to a villa, limit contact, bring only trusted servants. It worked for some, but flight came with risk. Traveling meant exposure. You'd pass through markets, inns, and roads filled with desperate people. A single contact might be enough. In Avignon, even the papal court was surrounded by corpses. So, would you stay or go? And then there's the question of whom to trust. Physicians were few, expensive, and often wrong. Their treatments, bloodletting, purging, crushed emerald powders, fought a little more than ritual. In Paris, a medical faculty issued a long report attributing the plague to a celestial event. It was copied across Europe, reinforcing the miasma theory. Would you rely on the church? Many did, but priests were dying in large numbers. Some fled, others stayed and paid with their lives. Masses were held in open air. People confessed in the streets. Some turned to flagellants. Others blamed the Jews. Each path reflected a choice due. You lean into faith, fear, or flight. Then there were the survival strategies. Burn aromatic herbs. Avoid the night air. Carry a sponge soaked in vinegar. Stay indoors. Board up the windows. These became daily habits for those who could afford them. In cities like Venice, officials ordered incoming ships to isolate at sea. It marked the origin of the word quarantine, from 40 giorni, 40 days. These measures had more impact than bleeding or prayer, but only a few places enforced them early. Statistically, if you were in Europe between 1347 and 1352, your chance of dying ranged from 1 in 3 to 1 in 2. Urban areas were hit harder. Rural regions, in some cases, were spared until they weren't. Children died faster. The elderly stood little chance. Men and women died at nearly equal rates. Social status mattered most in the first few months. Those with options survived longer, but even royalty was not immune. Joan of England, daughter of Edward III, died en route to a royal marriage in Castile. Her entire retinue was lost in the end. Survival often came down to luck: where you lived, who you lived with, what day the sickness reached your street. But every decision mattered, and most people made them in the dark, surrounded by fear, with no idea what they were facing. So if you lived then, without antibiotics, without science, with only instinct, wealth, or desperation, would you survive? Or would your name vanish into one of the countless graves dug under a plague-blackened sky? By 1353, the worst of the Black Death had passed, but the damage was irreversible. In just 6 years, Europe had lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population. Cities like Florence and Paris saw tens of thousands buried in mass graves. Entire villages vanished from maps. In England, more than 1,300 settlements were abandoned permanently. The death toll reshaped everything. With fewer hands to work the land, labor became scarce. Fields once tilled by serfs went to seed. Lords faced mounting losses. Crops rotted. Rents dried up. And the balance of power between landowners and peasants began to shift. In England, this tension erupted into violence. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt shook the kingdom. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, thousands marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, fair wages, and lower taxes. While the rebellion was eventually crushed, the old feudal order had been permanently weakened. In the decades that followed, serfdom declined across much of Western Europe. Laborers were no longer bound by the same terms. They could negotiate. And for the first time in centuries, many walked away from their lords in the cities. Surviving workers demanded higher wages. Guilds struggled to maintain control. Governments responded with wage caps and anti-labor laws. England's Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 were early attempts to freeze pre-plague wages, but enforcement proved difficult. The market had shifted. Workers knew their worth, and employers, desperate to rebuild, often had no choice but to pay. Land changed hands. As noble families died out, their holdings were absorbed, sold, or passed to distant heirs. The concentration of property altered local economies. In some cases, the church acquired vast new lands. In others, ambitious merchants or newly wealthy commoners stepped into the vacuum. Social mobility, previously rare, became possible. The church, once the unshakable center of medieval life, faced a credibility crisis. Clergy had died in large numbers, many of them young and inexperienced replacements. Survivors questioned the church's ability to protect or explain the catastrophe. Attendance dropped. Trust eroded. Though religion remained central, its grip weakened, setting the stage for reform movements in the following century. Culturally, the trauma left its mark. Art, literature, and religious expression became darker, more introspective. Images of death and judgment filled manuscripts, altarpieces, and murals. The Danse Macabre motif, a procession of skeletons dancing with the living, spread across Europe. It reflected a new awareness. Death could come at any moment, to anyone. The plague also left its mark on medicine. While most treatments had failed, Some authorities began to take public health more seriously. In cities like Venice and Milan, officials experimented with isolation, inspection, and quarantine. It was not yet modern medicine, but it was a step toward it. The Black Death didn't just kill. It dismantled the world it found and forced a new one into being. Labor gained value. Power structures cracked. Certainties dissolved. Europe entered a period of transformation, shaped by loss, but also by the need to rebuild from it. The Black Death left behind more than empty homes and unmarked graves. It left questions. Why had it happened? Could it return? And what could be done to stop it next time? While many turned to familiar explanations, the Vene punishment corrupted Ersum began to ask different questions. Cities that had watched their populations collapse looked for practical answers. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, issued a new regulation. Incoming ships had to anchor offshore for 30 days before passengers could disembark. That period would soon extend to 40 days, or 40 giorni, giving rise to the word quarantine. Venice followed suit. Lazaretto's plague hospitals, isolated on nearby islands, were established. These were not based on germ theory, which still didn't exist, but on observation. Isolation worked. Municipal governments grew more involved in public health. Inspectors were appointed. Burial procedures were standardized. Cities like Milan and Florence began tracking deaths and symptoms. Cleanliness became a civic concern. In places where quarantine and waste removal were enforced early, mortality rates were often lower. At the same time, the church's hold began to loosen. Thousands of clergy had died, some while caring for the sick, others while fleeing. Replacement priests were quickly ordained, often without proper training. Confidence in church leadership declined. Survivors questioned its spiritual authority. The seeds of skepticism, small at first, were planted. In the following century, voices like Jan Hus and later Martin Luther would challenge church doctrine openly. The Reformation would not have happened without centuries of eroded trust, much of it rooted in the plague years. In medicine, the catastrophe exposed deep flaws. Traditional treatments based on humoral theory and astrological charts had failed on a massive scale. Universities still taught Galen, but a few began to re-evaluate. Surgeons and practitioners who relied on practical observation gained status. Anatomy studies expanded. The groundwork for Renaissance medicine began to take form. Yet the lessons were incomplete. The plague did not vanish. Outbreaks returned, in waves for centuries. London in 1665, Marseille in 1720, Moscow in 1771. Each time, public health measures improved slightly, but without an understanding of bacteria or transmission vectors, complete prevention remained impossible. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The Black Death forced medieval society to confront mortality, question its systems, and adapt in ways that would echo for generations. In the process, it brought about the earliest movements toward modern public health, medical reform, and intellectual change born from the silence left by tens of millions of dead. The year is 1348. You're dropped into a world without science, without modern medicine, and without warning. There's no explanation for the sickness sweeping through streets and homes. All you see are symptom-swollen lymph nodes, fever, vomiting, and death within days. You don't know about bacteria. You've never heard of fleas on rats. You just know people are dying, fast. Would you flee the city, hoping distance would protect you? Many did. In Florence, nobles escaped to countryside villas. In England, landowners abandoned their manors. But flight was no guarantee. The disease traveled in silence, carried by goods, servants, travelers. Those who ran often brought it with them. Would you turn to the church, attend public processions, fast, pray, or confess? Some did, only to fall ill days later. Others joined flagellant bands, punishing their bodies in hopes of redemption. Some blamed outsiders and watched mobs burn entire communities. Desperation had many paths. Would you trust physicians? Their advice was often elaborate: carry sweet-smelling herbs, avoid the night air, balance your humors with leeches or purgatives. They meant well, but they didn't understand the cause. Most treatments failed. In some cases, they accelerated death. Or would you lock your doors, isolate, and hope no one around you was infected? Quarantine was a concept still forming. A few cities like Milan enforced crude versions by sealing entire households. Harsh, but sometimes effective. The choices weren't clear. The rules shifted daily. Rumors filled the gaps. If a neighbor died, would you care for them or bar your door? If your child showed symptoms, would you hold them or leave? The answers weren't obvious. Every decision carried risk. Survival, in most cases, came down to where you lived, how soon the plague reached you, and how isolated your world was before it arrived. Some mountain villages were spared entirely. Others collapsed within days. If you had been there, stripped of everything you know now, would you make it through? Would you be remembered in a will, listed on a death roll, or buried nameless in a pit? Or would you survive, scarred but alive, watching a changed world emerge from the wreckage? History doesn't record the close calls. It keeps track of the outcomes. And in 1348, survival was not a reward for knowledge, it was a gamble. One most people lost. The question isn't just whether you would survive. It's what you would become while trying.